So ready to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that working? Okay. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm in this properly. Yeah. Yeah. Not too much. Quite a lot. Yeah. Right. Behind me on the board, everyone, I've got two lists of three, and they're going to give us the structure to this lecture today. On the left-hand side is what you can expect to see in the exam, and on the right-hand side is the way I divide up this collection of poetry. I'm going to start with the exam questions. They fall into three categories: theme, editorial, and technique, okay, as on the board. And theme and editorial are dominant from what I can see from past papers, all right? What do I mean by that? Well, it's as simple as this. The examiners will choose a theme which recurs in the poetry and set a question on how Duffy treats it, and they'll usually invite you with a little formula to do about one or more poems, or they'll name a poem and ask you to relate it to others. Yeah? Editorial are those questions that say things like, how fitting is this as the first poem? Would this make a good last poem? In what ways is this poem key to the collection? They like that one. Is it key to the collection? And when I recently saw an AQA lecturer with students in town, he was very fussy about the word key, saying there's only ever one key. And my students and I are a little bit, partly because the Film Studies Board quite often uses the idea of key in the plural, you know, key ways into text and so on. But for him, it's suggesting that one poem kind of unlocks the collection. You can get all the sort of major ideas and techniques out of that poem and apply it to the rest as a whole. Yeah? The third one that comes up less often than the other two is technique. And I think it comes up less because probably it's harder to set a question on. It would be something, say, rhythm or rhyme. The typical techniques that Duffy uses, everyone, for instance, includes the use of ordinary, what we call demotic language, the ordinary language of the people, in surprising or poetic ways. Yeah? But they can pick potentially any technique that she uses fairly regularly and say, what do you think? What does she use this technique for? Yeah? And so that list that you've all got from Mr. Evans, I think you've all got it, right? You will have that list, yeah. It's a handy little checklist about the techniques which are typical of poetry, prose and drama. And if you look at the poetry list, the things for me that are really important in poetry tend to be those big, broad things. So I'm not so much interested in alliteration and assonance and onomatopoeia. I'm interested in structure and form, of course, the style of the author, language types, what a language and literature student might call lexical fields, related sets of terms on a given subject, diction. I've mentioned already that she uses kind of common language. She tends to use fairly simple contemporary language, doesn't she? Yeah. You don't have to go away to a dictionary very often when you're reading Carol Ann Duffy, but the complexity arises in how she uses those words. Yeah. All right, is that okay then, everyone? In terms of those three question types that are going to be coming up, and you need to be ready to be able to deal with each of them. And what I'd like to do is to suggest on the right-hand column behind me that there is a division in the collection into three, and you can use that division as a useful starting point, certainly in the editorial questions. Those questions that ask you, is this the best poem to be first? In what ways is this poem typical, or that favourite word of theirs, key to the collection? So I'll say a few words everyone about that structuring of the collection, and then I'll go into a couple of individual poems with you. All right? So the way I've put it, everyone, I've called it Gospels, Stafford, and Confession. What I'm getting at, everyone, is what I think of what she calls feminine Gospels, includes a Gospel reference. In the Virgin's memo, she's obviously alluding to the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus in the Bible. Most of the Gospels, in inverted commas, of course, are not Gospels in that Christian sense, and they're not Gospels in the broader sense of texts which are verifiably true. You know that expression, the gospel truth? You know, it must be true because it's come from a number of different sources. Of course, people who are looking seriously at the texts of the Bible, where they came from historically, are not going to talk about gospel truth in that way anyway. But in terms of a text that tells you a religious truth, that's not what the Gospels do. Instead, they take up ideas, the sort of ideas that you might get in a book of history, in philosophy, in theology or religion, certainly in the politics of gender, and they come at them in surprising and inventive ways. And I think when I start mentioning some of the titles in a minute, you'll all be reminded about how Duffy has a shtick, a way of going at it that's very recognisable from the first third, what I'm calling the Gospels part of Feminine Gospels. All right. So in opening the book now, everyone, and running my eye down, that first third, the Long Queen, Map Woman, Beautiful, the Diet, the Woman Who Shopped, Worked, Tall, Loud, History. It seems to me they have an approach which is very recognisable. Typically what they do is they start with something that you recognise or think you recognise. So when you read The Long Queen, she's invented her, but at first you're thinking, oh, is this something I read in a folk tale or a fairy tale when I was a kid that Carol Ann Duffy is now reworking? When you see the Map Woman, you know that this is a fantastic creature, someone who's the map of whose the town where she grew up is imprinted on her, and she sloughs it off towards the end of the poem. She sheds it, doesn't she, like a skin, like a snake. You know that that doesn't happen, but you also recognise there's a real person there. It feels quite autobiographical, or perhaps biographical. The allusions to real places in different towns, for instance, seems to be making it autobiographical. And I'll say more about that, especially in the last third of the collection. So the shtick, everyone, is she starts with something recognisable. Okay, and we're losing the screen. Let's take as an example, everybody, history. So that poem, if you can all have a look at it on page 27. And it begins like this. She woke up, old at last, alone. Bones in a bed, not a tooth in her head, half dead. Shuffled and limped downstairs in the rag of her nightdress, smelling of pee. Slurp tea, it goes on in the second stanza. So what we begin with, everyone, is a very recognisable situation. We might say it's of old age in isolation and neglect, something of urban squalor in it, all right? But what it then rapidly becomes is something much more inflated, something much more escalated. It gets to be history. And this sweep across time, most of it must be said involving great cruelties across the period of Christianity. But it blows up from this individual story of neglect into this massive she was history, where we get in stanza 3 or 4. Okay. In that sense of run, it moves very rapidly into different metaphorical places or metaphorical moments. So a recognisable character in a concrete world, then taken by the poet's flight of fancy into something quite different. So the old woman becomes history itself, the abstraction embodied or personified. She becomes a witness to history, a witness to the horrors and terrors. And in a sense then we get the two levels marrying up. We get the level of the neglected little old lady, as it were, who has shit posted in through her letterbox, but no more useful gifts than that, it seems, with that sweep of human cruelty across many centuries. You know, these centuries in which stone grows up. Lovely image of stone growing up in the city, yeah? A kind of cold, remorseless stone. Kuja, are we happy? Yeah. Okay. What I'm claiming then in the first third of run is that history is typical of the technique that Duffy adopts overall in what I'm calling the Gospels. Now, of course, it's not a perfect description. There are different things going on in different poems. She doesn't, for instance, use the same verse form. But what is interesting and repeats throughout, I think, is this playful tone with a really serious intent. There's a kind of black comedy at work in history. This rag of a nightdress, this pathetic figure, i.e. a figure who will move us to pity, hopefully, nonetheless is almost comical. And the immediate rhymes, the internal rhymes that Duffy uses suggest that. Rhyming P and T across stanzas. So it's not even an enjambment. It goes from one stanza into the next. There's a sort of black comedy. Now the intention of black comedy, everyone, of course, is not just to make us laugh, it's to make us look at and think about the dark cruelties and absurdities of life. You could imagine, everyone, an old people's charity using history. She was history. In that colloquial sense, she used to mean something when she was younger, when she was beautiful, when she had a job, whatever it might be. And now she doesn't mean anything to anybody, it seems. So what I began this lecture with, talking about Duffy's use of colloquial or demotic language, applies there. You've got a double meaning. She's history. She's past it, she's gone. But also this symbolic level. And where a great deal of the riches lie is in that kind of multiple levelling and the drawing together the individual cruelty along with the cruelty across time. Now, for you as students, everyone, I've got the left-hand side of the board in my mind constantly. I'm thinking all the time that you've got to do an examination on feminine gospels rather than have an interesting chat in the pub about it. All right, so I'm thinking about how when you get a question on the themes or the techniques or indeed the editorial, you can apply a poem like this. Look for the complexity. don't be tempted to give too pat an answer, too easy an answer. They're wanting you to say, it's mainly like this, but there's this interesting exception. Or, on the one hand it's this, on the other it's this other thing. Okay, so they're looking for you to open up a kind of debate. When they put a contention in about a thing, so say for instance they put Carol Ann Duffy's poetry is always dark. They don't want you to say, yes, Carol Ann Duffy's poetry always is dark, and here are 3 really dark poems, including history. They want you to say, well, what a good example of a poem that's very dark, that makes us confront unpleasant things in our society where a person can be neglected in this way. It's history. But as I read it, there's a sort of black humour to it as well. So you're saying, yes, but, or yes, but as well as that, have you thought about? And you're also thinking, everybody, about the counter-examples. So if it's true of history, and if it's true, say, of beautiful, is it less true of another poem that you want to talk about, either in the what I'm calling the Gospel section or later in the collection? Is that okay as far as that section goes in front? Let's think then about The Laughter of Stafford Girls High, which I enjoy very much. A very funny poem, beautifully written. It's a poem with great rhythm, great kind of panache. There's an energy kind of bursting out of Stafford Girls High, metaphorically, of course, in the school itself and in the lives of the women affected by it, but also in the way the poem is written. So the poem itself attempts to enact what it describes. It wants to be this outpouring of female comic energy that it's talking about. Right, so let's have a look at Stafford Girls High. It's on page 35. And one of the things that's enjoyable for me as a teacher when I hear about school is everyone knows school. Anyone I talk to, if I say I'm a teacher, they've always got school stories, some of them sad, about when they were bullied at school or felt that they weren't stretched, or their dyslexia was overlooked and they were made to feel stupid, or whatever it might be. Most people have funny stories, things that made them laugh about the behaviour of children in certain classes, and most typically eccentric teachers. Okay, the wacky things that they did. And one of the lovely things here is that recognisable quality. There's also a kind of fantasy here, isn't there? I mean, partly there's the fantasy of the relationship between, is it Miss Dunn and the girl who's the captain of sports in the poem, that ends in this sort of delicious, romantic, tragic death, a bit like a lesbian version of Romeo and Juliet. You know, they embrace in death, they have their adventure. I better go and touch the computer. It gets to feeling lonely and stops playing.
So was with the Laughter of Stafford Girls High, with the Miss Dunn and Captain Spots, did they end up being romantically engaged before when they were climbing Mount Everest, or was it just like a friendship thing and then they died in each other's arms?
It's clearly sexual, it's clearly erotic. And it would be, in a way, Michael, it's a good question about what it's kind of saying and doing. It's saying something that's rather taboo, especially these days. But it's also it's also playing around with very familiar underlying tropes or motifs in teenage girls' fiction from the late 19th century and through the 20th century. Girls' fiction set in all-girls schools where there are dormitories and there are kind of interactions, and there's often a sort of underlying erotic that Carol Ann Duffy is playing with here quite clearly. Yeah, she's making it quite overt, the erotic connection. And of course, the erotics of the poem are lesbian in a way that is not so overt in most of the rest of the collection. Now, of course, I have to be careful here. Carol Ann Duffy does not like the idea of being a lesbian poet. She doesn't like that label. She doesn't want to be limited into she's in this camp. All right, she's a representative or what have you. She wants to be out there, being imaginative, being elusive, not someone that you can tie down. If you can tie down a poem, you've kind of killed it off. Yeah, it needs always to be more suggestive, more slippery than you think it ought to be, which is part of the kind of paradox of my lecturing you about it, because I'm trying to sort of tie down meanings, aren't I? I'm trying to say to you, this is what you should say in an exam. But it should always be partly undetermined. It should always be a sense of, oh, the next time I've read it, there's a new thought. And when I talked to Gemma about the poem, she said something I'd never thought of. All right. It can be read allegorically, by the way, as a story of feminism, in which I suppose the laughter of the girls represents a joyous release of female power imposed by backwards-looking institutions and implemented, of course, by other women. And this is one of another kind of strange paradox, that when women are oppressed, their oppressors are often female at the immediate level. So if you take FGM, female genital mutilation, that's often carried out by mothers, grandmothers, aunts, other members of extended families or communities who think they are doing the right thing and the best thing by the child or the young woman. But to us, I'm sure we'd all agree they're doing something terribly wrong, but they're implementing a patriarchal attitude to the woman's body, which is a woman's body that experiences pleasure is a dangerous body. It might release dangerous oppositional energies, so it needs to be curtailed. Is that making sense, everyone? Is it in relation to Stafford Girls' High? So, everyone, this poem, again, like so many of the poems in the first third, it's very funny, I think, very playful and seriousness of intent. At the end, I'm reminded of Virginia Woolf. There's a new production coming out, I think, in ballet of the life and works of Virginia Woolf at the moment, who famously died by drowning. And there's something rather wonderful. So if we turn to the end over on page 54, the last 6 lines say, by dawn at John O'Groats, Mrs. Mackay had finally run out of land. She wrote her maiden name with a stick in the sand, then walked into the sea. Steady at first, step by step, till the firm waves lifted her under her arms and danced her away like a groom with a bride. High above, in the cold sky, the seagulls, like schoolgirls, laughed. Higher again, a teacher fell through the clouds with a girl in her arms. So what we get, everyone, at the end is this sort of, you might say, almost masochistic ending. Always, if it is masochistic, being played with. She's always taking those ideas. She's always got her tongue a bit in her cheek, Carol Ann Duffy, I think. But at the end, we nonetheless have this kind of romantic tragedy. In the case of Mrs. Mackay, who's rejected the limitations of her stifling heterosexual marriage, the flip side of that seems to be this lesbian embrace itself has led to death. But these deaths, everyone, feel like exciting, adventurous, romantic deaths. And that's why I think they, in my mind, they tap into these kind of girls' own stories of daring do. I'm going to be a mountain climber. I'm going to be a writer and an artist. I'm going to give up this bourgeois limited life and go out and properly live. Yeah. And the ending is at once happy and tragic. It is to be celebrated even as they are lifted away off into the elements. Okay, is that all right, everyone, on Stafford Girls High? Yeah? All right, so everyone, the last third, I'm calling confession. It's probably the wrong word because it makes it sound as if what Carol Ann Duffy is doing is in some way saying, I've done wrong and I need to atone for my sins, like I was brought up a Roman Catholic, like a Catholic might do. And I don't mean that by it. I just couldn't think of anything better when I was thinking about this lecture. What I mean by confessional here, everyone, is it seems to me that in the third section of this collection, we enter a much more intimate, autobiographical, reflective and self-reflective mode. It's one, I think, in which we get closer to Duffy as a writer, perhaps, but in my view, certainly as a person. The mood and tone move away from some of that playfulness and into something that's rather sombre at times, still joyous often, still celebratory, still loving life. But the reminiscences are often rather painful, specifically associated with death in more than one poem. In this, they're associated as well with new life. There's a poem about her daughter. And of course there are exceptions as well to the rule. But I think they're really interestingly put together. And if you're doing an editorial question about the last poem, or indeed the first poem, or a poem being a key to the collection, you need to be thinking, in my view, and this is obviously quite generalised, more generalised than perhaps it ought to be, but if you think of the collection in terms of thirds, that really works for me anyway, that neat division, all right? So, let's have a look at the list of the poems I've run in what I'm calling confessional. So after The Laughter of Stafford Girls High, we've got A Dreaming Week, White Writing, Gambler, The Light Gatherer, The Chord, Wish, Northwest, Death and the Moon. Now, of course, the title of the last poem tells us clearly about its dominant theme, but the two poems before it, Wish and Northwest, Wish is obviously about death, and Northwest seems to be a reminiscence. I don't know if I'm overreading it, but I think it's about her early life with the poet Adrian Henry. I think this computer is spoiled. So, if they are about death, the chord, obviously, it seems to be an umbilical chord as well as a symbolic chord, is about life and new life. Gambler, well, among the things that we know about Carol Ann Duffy, she is a celebrity poet of a kind, everybody. She is, after all, a poet laureate. We do know things about her, and she is fairly candid in interview. She herself has been a big drinker and a big gambler. White writing seems to be an autobiographical love poem about, again, specifically in this case, a lesbian relationship. Interestingly, everyone, now that gay people can marry, maybe she needs to rewrite white writing. Maybe she needs to do a new version of it, because it's about that not having the institutional structures and approval that heterosexual love can find in marriage. All right? So is that making sense to everybody? Do you recognise what I'm talking about in these three sections, even if it's quite broad? Yeah, some of you, yeah. Okay, I'm getting some nods. Right, everyone, let's look then at one or two of the poems. If we look on Gambler on page 58, I'm going to read you the opening stanza and 2 words. She goes for the sound of the words, the beauty they hold, in the movement they make on the air, the shape of the breath of a word, leaving her lips like a whistle or kiss. It's interesting to me, everyone, that a poem that strikes me as so autobiographical begins with the word she. So one needs to be careful. If these poems are intimate and autobiographical, Duffy is writing them as a professional poet. And we shouldn't be under any illusion. There's no straightforward transmission of my thoughts and feelings come out in my poem, and you can read them. She's writing for herself, but she's also writing very consciously for an audience. And she's using the conventions that go with that. So if it is her who goes for the sound of the words, like you might expect a poet to. Duffy is intentionally making it a third person and not a first person persona. It becomes then, everyone, a strange poem, one unlike The Woman Who Shopped or Diet in the first third. If Gambler had been in the first third of the collection, it seems to me, we would have ended up with somebody who gambled away the earth until it exploded in some sort of environmental cataclysm. The sort of thing that's promised in Work, yeah, where we end up with this image of Mother Nature trying to spawn something, pulling out her teeth to try and grow some food, or sticking her tongue in the river, hoping to spawn some new life there. That's where Gambler would end up, it seems to me, in the first third. But here, there's a lighter touch. It's less conclusive than that. It's less directive. And it ends up not being, God, isn't it a shame that people lose loads of money, waste loads of money, can become addicted to gambling and ruin their lives. You've all heard terrible stories, I'm sure, about people going to jail because they've ended up swindling their friends and family and employer out of money so that they could feed their addiction. She doesn't do that. She doesn't play that game. Singing it over and over again in her head, which was why she guessed she decided to pick Sharp Spice, 5-2 fade, to gallop in third. The words seemed to fit. Most days she sits with her stump of a pen, writing the poems of bets. And it becomes, paradoxically, a celebration of words and indeed poems, as well as an amusing an insightful reflection on the joys of gambling. But it seems to me, everyone, it's probably more about poetry, it's probably more about words, in a way, than it is about that powerful drive that we see earlier in Dyer and The Woman Who Shot. Those drives that tap into something in our brains, the addictive part, that makes us keep coming back. The celebratory poems of Rum, the chord says for Ella, and once you get these dedications of Rum, we've got one at the beginning of Stafford Girls High, and we've got a couple in the last third, in what I'm calling the confession. The last poem is for Catherine Marcangeli, the wife of Adrian Henry, after his death. Very moving, very touching elegy. Those little dedications of her, I think, say so much. You're not going to put a dedication under The Woman Who Shot, are you? There's not going to be a dedication for somebody whose body ends up being opened up as a shop for everybody to come and visit. I don't think there are many women who'd want to have that dedicated to them. The Chord and Light Gather are very touching poems, I think, about her relationship to the daughter, and they're rather beautiful. You might even say sentimental, if you were that way inclined. Light Gatherer, for instance, ends like this on page 60. And now you shine like a snow girl, a buttercup under a chin, the wide blue yonder you squeal at and fly in, like a jewelled cave, turquoise and diamond and gold, opening out at the end of a tunnel of years. As if her life, or the life of the persona in the poem at least, has been heading towards this magical wonder of motherhood. Yeah? And the chord does something similar. There are strains, aren't there, on the chord, from the fantastical, folkloric, folktale, fairy tale quality of the first poem, The Long Queen, but also it's anchored in the immediate, the physical, the intimate and the loving, I think. Wish is one of my favourite poems of Rum. It's the one where she has a wish that I guess all of us have when we lose somebody we love. So it's a what if poem. I'll read you a little of that. Wish. But what if, in the clammy soil, her limbs grew warmer, shifted, stirred, kicked off the covering of earth, the drowsing corns, the sly worms? What if her arms reached out to grab the stone, the grooves of her dates under her thumb, and pulled her up? I wish. In that opening of Rum, we get that very strong wish fulfillment. I don't know if you've ever spoken to anyone or had this experience yourself, but it's very common. And I've had it once or twice in my life. Walking down the street and thinking for a moment, I see somebody I know and love who's died. And just for a second or a fraction of a second, you have that recognition, and afterwards you say, I wish. As I said earlier, in my point about her use of colloquial language, that very familiar conversational use, that idiomatic use, it's an idiom, I wish, meaning something like, I know it's not going to happen. Nonetheless, I can't help desiring it. Yeah? It also has that meaning of, I wish, I'm just telling you, that's what I wish for. And she wishes everyone for the defeat of death. Not a Christian poem, everyone, and this is determinedly humanist, I think, this final third of the collection. It's a third that celebrates what it means to be a human being in birth and in death, and it doesn't give us the familiar succour, the familiar reassurances that religion does. In fact, she taps into resurrection imagery and then twists it to her own purposes at the end of the poem, where she says this: "If I can only push open this heavy door, she'll be standing there in the sun, dirty, tired, wondering, why do I shout? Why do I run?" And if you can imagine, everyone, it's clearly a Jesus image, isn't it? It's Jesus on the third day, rolling back by divine power the stone in front of his tomb. But in this version, if she rises Jesus-like or Lazarus-like from her tomb, the Duffy persona doesn't stay to say, wow, my wish has come true. It's more, be careful what you wish for. Here's a zombie. We've almost aren't we, into that territory, the zombie territory, and we get that hint of that. It's almost Michael Jackson's video for Thriller. In the opening image, the arm rising from the clammy soil to clutch the indents of words on her tombstone. So it's in a slightly kitsch territory of life after death. And we do run from it, of course. It speaks of the story The Monkey's Paw, where a couple use this magical totem. Would you? Thanks. This little totemic device, it has magic powers that you can wish by, and they wish for some money, what have you, and their son is killed in an industrial accident, and then they get this money they wished for as compensation. So in the third wish, the mother wishes for the son back. But death is cruel. And when the knock comes to the door, the father knows that the knocker will not be their son as they remember him. They'll be the son as death has left him, dragging himself by this mystical power to the door. So the father seizes the monkey's paw and makes a final wish for the son back in his grave. Because at the end of the story, terrible though that truth is, we have to accept death. It's a poetic truth, everyone, and I mean by that, it's the kind of truth that poets specifically have made their theme all across time. Yeah, love and death. And if this final third, everyone, is sombre, because more than one person she loves has died, and she commemorates them in her own way in these poems, at the same time this final third is personally joyous. And that's what I mean when I say humanist. It's something that says, well, look, we've got to face it. We're all going to die. And before we get there, we're almost definitely going to lose to death people that we love. That's nature. But that also is what gives us a joy in life, the fact that life does come to an end. So everyone, to conclude then, what I've been trying to do in the lecture today really is marry up how I think the poetry is organised and written with what you're going to be required to do in the exam. When you get there, you'll have a choice of one from two questions. You'll read them, let them sink in, but don't spend too long, because you don't get any marks for choosing the right one to do. You'll choose your question and commit to it. then you'll prosecute it as seriously as you can. Now, for those of you who are aiming for A and A star at A2, you'll have to do that brave thing of not writing for a while. Sitting and thinking and planning an answer in which you'll marshal your evidence. You'll decide, how many poems am I going to use in order to get the best illustration to answer this specific question? Don't try to do one. It does sometimes say one or more poems, but it's a real risk, I think, to try and only do one, especially if it's an editorial question asking you about how this is key or typical of the collection. Do at least 2 poems. You usually go for 3. Once you get into the realm of 4 or 5 poems, it becomes harder to say significant things because you need to build up an argument about your poem. All right? But if you can do it, great. The key thing is to make that decision early on. Which poems am I using and what am I going to use each one for? Okay? Weaker students will say another example is, and again this shows, you don't want to fall into that trap. You want to be saying each poem, they are connected, there are linkages between them, but each poem is doing different work in somewhat or significantly different ways. All right? And the key for me of Rum is when I sit down in that exam, if it were me, I'm thinking to myself, right, out of the 3 sections, the Gospels, Stafford Girls High, the Confessional, the Personal, the Intimate ones, am I exemplifying from each of those? Am I focusing very much on 1/3? But make sure you're making that decision for a good reason. Okay, I'll leave the lecture there, everyone. When we meet again on Tuesday, we will discuss any issues that have arisen. What I'd suggest now is people who need to go. Anyone who wants to hang on and discuss with other people for a minute, we could have another 5 minutes, say, where anything that's immediately come up that you kind of want to check with me while it's fresh in your mind, do it now. Okay? Otherwise, thank you for coming and have a good weekend.